Hi, and welcome to Remnant Wire Radio. I'm your host, Shannon Scholten-Adams, and we have a long-awaited, amazing interview for you today. If you've been following the program, you know that the heart of the program is to encourage you as a believer to be about your daddy's business, to understand your relationship with Jesus Christ, know Scripture, have a passion for Scripture, and have it just totally fundamentally change the way you view the world and what you actually do in the world. We know the church is suffering, and it's suffering from sensationalism, a lack of understanding, a lack of knowledge, among many other things. And we know we need the full armor of God to be put on, because the spiritual war is indeed ramping up more than probably ever before. But how do we fight that battle? How do we fight that war? How do we become equipped? Besides just reading Scripture and meditating on Scripture, a lot of our ability to be equipped to go out into the world and to make disciples of nations does come from being educated. And today is one of the programs in which we are going to help educate you on some of the amazing things that are happening abroad, specifically in the subject of Noah's Ark. Interestingly enough, we've talked about the Nephilim, we've talked about creation, we've talked about the fallen angel view versus the Sethite view, we've talked about a lot of different historical things recently, and today the cherry on top is Noah's Ark. With me is Andrew Jones, the lead archaeological researcher for Noah's Ark Scans, which has been making headlines, and you might have seen some reels and some clips on your social media pages, but there is so many amazing discoveries taking place, so much going on in the archaeological sect of proving Scripture, and we have none other than Andrew with us today. Andrew, thank you for being on the program.
Thank you, Shannon, for having me. I look forward to sharing what we're doing out here in Eastern Turkey.
Yes, and thank you for being with me from Eastern Turkey. I know that you're on the opposite side of the world from me, but this is definitely going to be an amazing program, and I'm excited to just find out everything that you and your team has been doing and discovering. So why don't you give the audience who maybe doesn't know about you or Noah's Ark Scan a little bit of information about yourself?
I grew up a Christian from Northern California. I moved around during my early years. My family, I lived in Ohio and Montana. But early in life, I was really interested in archaeology. One evening, my father went to this meeting in Sacramento, California, and he told me that this guy had presented evidence for Noah's Ark. And I wanted to find out more about it. His name was Ron Wyatt. That got me started on this journey researching this site to where I live about 30 minutes from here in Turkey. And so that's kind of been my side passion. I'm actually a computer programmer, but I kind of gave that up a number of years ago just to focus full time on this. And we also do tours, but the main thing is making videos and doing this research in the Middle East, especially in Turkey here. We formed this organization called Noah's Ark Scans. Its main focus is just to bring in individuals and scientists who are interested in researching and collaborating at the site and checking out, see what it is, because we believe it's not a natural formation. And so hopefully tonight I can share with your listeners some of the things we have uncovered and what other people have uncovered in the past.
That's amazing. So the Noah's Ark discovery was way before I was born. I think, if memory serves me right, the 50s, 59, somewhere around there, right? Actually, I think it's September 11th, right?
That is correct.
It was initially discovered.
What a strange date. Yeah, September 11, 59. What happened was it was discovered by a Turkish army captain. His name was İlhan Durupinar. And Captain Durupinar worked in the cartographer section of the Turkish military. Now, that year, Turkey joined NATO. And so they were mapping out their country, doing all these aerial flights and taking pictures from high altitude. And his job was to make these maps. So he worked in the capital of Ankara. And on that day, I don't know if it was a Friday or not, but anyways, it was a September 11, and he discovered this boat-shaped object, this popping out of the map, or the photographs, these high-altitude black and white photos. And he got excited. About a week later, they decided to release the information to the press. And then that went around the world. And then about a month later, they released the actual photographs. And that was in U.S. newspapers, and European and Turkish newspapers. And so everyone then saw what Captain Durupinar saw. And it's this boat shape with a pointed in, rounded on one side and pointed on the other. It looks like basically the imprint of a boat. sitting there on the side of this mountain in, you could say, the mountains of Ararat here in eastern Turkey. In fact, it's about a little over a mile, I think, from the Iranian border, which, as you know, Iran's in the news right now.
Yeah.
So interesting location to be doing the research. But this is what he discovered back in '59 and made everyone very excited.
Well, that's amazing. So now from aerial photos all the way to today, right, from 1959, we're 2025, quite the distance from the initial discovery. Your team works with archaeologists. I take it you guys do GPR and ERT scans and core drilling and excavation and all of the liking. So let's get into it a little bit. Tell me about some of the research you've done and the extraordinary findings. We're trying to prove that it's Noah's Ark, right? I don't think, have you definitively said this is it? I mean, we know we're going to get into your facts a little later, but we're trying to prove that. So how far have we come from just aerial photos to today with what you're doing?
Yeah, let's go through the whole story, because I think it's a fascinating journey. The site has been in the news and up and down, and so sometimes you hear about it, other times you don't. And the reason why we've seen it in the news recently is because of our recent soil tests and GPR, these ground penetrating radar scans. And that has got the press excited. But let's backtrack back to '59. So in '59, when they first photographed it, to Captain Durupinar, he was amazed because he did not see another one of these objects. So some people say, oh, these are found all over that area. No, there's only one boat-shaped formation in his survey of this area of eastern Turkey. And that is why it made the headlines. It wasn't a fleet of these out there. Yeah. And so it was unique. And so in his mind, it looked like a shipwreck on the side of a mountain. So in 1960, an American Christian organization, I forget the name of the group, but they wanted to go see it. They were interested in creationism and looking for Noah's Ark. And so this Christian group that had an archaeologist, it had some business people, and a writer, and then one or two pastors or evangelists, they went over to Turkey in June 1960, and they met with Captain Durupinar and the Turkish military. Now, that summer, there was a military coup. They didn't know if they would even get permission to go out to eastern Turkey during this political upheaval in Turkey. But they did get permission, and they worked with Captain Durupinar himself and the military and went out to the site. And the first photographs of that were published in the Turkish magazine Hayat magazine, which means life in Turkey. So it's just like it's the counterpart to the American Life magazine. Yeah, so those photographs were published in the Turkish media in July, and then September 5th edition in 1960 published the the American edition of that expedition. And they showed the first ground photographs, and you can see this oval, you can call it oval shape, but this boat-shaped object just sitting there and with rough terrain all around it, which is very interesting because it's this unique kind of smooth object with grass growing on it, but it's the shape of a boat. They talked to the locals. I even met one of the gentlemen who actually runs the visitor center that's there today. His uncle and mother were alive in the 1940s, and they said in the past, in late 1940s, either 48 or 49, they said an earthquake hit this region. And before that, this whole hillside was smooth. They were planting wheat and crops, and they had sheep roaming around like they do today. But in 48 or 49, an earthquake hit the region, and this is a very tectonic, active, volcanic region with a lot of volcanoes around here, actually. And so they're kind of used to earthquakes like California is. Well, this object popped out of the ground in the sense that everywhere around it was all rough, like the whole side, and they call it an earth flow. It just turned to like jello, you could say. And it was this rough terrain. So there went their wheat fields, but the boat-shaped object remained.
Yeah.
And so that's what was photographed about 10 years later in '59. And then 1 year later, we have the American expedition out there with the Turks, and they're taking photographs of this on the ground. And you can see all the way around this boat-shaped object, just rough with crevices and, rocks and boulders. But then you have this perfectly boat-shaped sitting there. And so that hit the news. And now that year, Ron Wyatt, who was one of the people instrumental in getting this back into the news and promoting it in Noah's Ark in the 1980s and 90s. That's when he first learned about it. He saw the September 5th edition of Life magazine, And then he came out here in the late 70s and started his own research. And so now looking at the late 70s and early 80s, the one thing that Ron first did when he went up back here on his second trip in 79, he took 2 soil samples, one from outside of the boat formation as like a control to compare it. And then he took soil from deep inside a crevice that a earthquake that hit the region in 78 created this crack down the middle. And so he's able to get some really good one soil sample deep inside the object. And he brought those 2 samples back to the U.S. and had them tested. And what it showed was that there's at least almost 3 times more carbon inside deep inside this formation compared to outside. Now, it was just from one location. He only did these 2 samples, so he couldn't do any stats on it and analysis besides just the chemical composition. But that got him interested, saying, okay, well, maybe there's something to this boat shape, because here we have different soil inside versus right outside of it.
Yeah.
If it's just a natural object, you expect it all to be the same material.
That means there's probably some kind of like decomposition inside, right? I'm not a I'm not a science nerd.
Yes.
But there's like some breaking down of organic matter. It would change that pH and stuff.
Oh, exactly. And that's why his sample, he was really interested in it, because it was showing this higher carbon, which suggests that, yes, if this was a giant wooden boat, as the Bible describes Noah's Ark as, then as this boat decayed over the thousands of years, it left the chemical imprint in the soil and it changed that. And so that's what he was, he just took some samples, didn't know what the results would be, and he got these results. So that furthered his interest in the site. And so then fast forward 4 or 5 years later, in the mid-'80s, he came back out there and he took some more samples from different locations in there. But the biggest thing, he decided to check to see if there was a pattern of metal, because some of the samples had high iron. And so he said, okay, let's try to use metal detectors. These are all non-destructive ways to investigate a site. And he did not have a permit to excavate, so he just used regular, the high-end models, but regular beach, comb metal detectors that you'd use to find coins on a beach or whatever. And so he took them out there, and lo and behold, they were getting a pattern of metal just inside that boat-shaped object versus outside that was showing a reading going up and down and across it inside the boat. And so then they said, let's connect the dots here. Let's see if it shows anything, visually. And so they used caution tape, like construction tape, and they placed them they pinned them down everywhere they were getting a metal reading. And it was showing these linear patterns. About a year after that, one of the first uses of GPR, it was initially something that was new in archaeology at that time. And they decided to use it here. I think they said it was the first time used in Turkey.
Wow.
But what it does, it's kind of like sonar, you could say, for land.
Yeah.
So it's shooting these electromagnetic signals or waves multiple times, thousands of times a second into the soil and the rocks. And then it bounces back based on the density. It will come back at different times to your receiver, and then the computer can process it. Well, back then, it would print out, this is like 85, 86, I believe. It would print out a thermal paper, the old
oh man,
printer.
I remember thermal paper.
It would print out like these long rolls of what they're scanning. So in real time, you're looking at these results of what's below the surface. So it was a way to peer below the soil without digging a hole, as you usually do in archaeology. What they found right away, I think it was 86, they did this, the first one. They found 13 lines, these periodic patterns of reflections that were showing up. There's right across near the upper end, right near the pointed end, you could call it the bow if you want, of this ship formation. And they, again, they're just doing this in the field, getting results, see what's trying to see what's under the ground. And they took it to the United States, and then on local television, the manufacturer, the vice president of the company, GSSI, who made the radar, and they're still around today making radar units. The guy explained on local news that these patterns were too periodic, that you would not find it like this in nature. I'm paraphrasing. Basically, he was saying that, like you're seeing a pattern of reflections below the surface instead of random noise that you would expect from a mud flow or earth flow on the side of a mountain. And so that got them more excited. They went ahead and did, over the next couple of years, complete radar scans of the site with more metal detector scans. And that fast forwards us to 87. By then, the Turkish government, they had their own scientists out there looking at it. The results of all this was that they decided to declare this a national park. And so there's some confusion as to, what do they actually declare?
Yeah.
Basically, they say that this is the shadow or imprint of a boat formation that is part of the Noah's Ark story. They didn't declare, in the official documents that I saw, they didn't say this is Noah's Ark, but they wanted to make it a national park to preserve it for, number one, future research, and number two, for people to come see it. They don't want a local farmer from the village, up on the hill to plow it, plant his corn on top of it.
Yeah.
So the government bought the land and built a visitor center in 87. That building is still there today. It's been renovated a couple times. That's basically where it was at back in the 80s, and then the early 90s. During the first Gulf War, there was a lot of terrorist activity in this area that it basically kind of stopped some of the research and things going forward. And so it was very difficult to get out there. But in 1997, I was able to come out here with a friend of mine. He needed a travel companion, so he asked me. I was in the middle of college at the time, and he said, "Hey, Andrew, you want to go for 4 or 5 days to see this site, and let's check it out ourselves." He didn't want to tell my friend. He's passed away, but his name was Bill Fry. And he was from Florida, and he didn't want to tell Ron Wyatt. Ron was kind of like one of the biggest promoter of the site, being Noah's Ark, and done a lot of the research at that time. And we both knew Ron. I met him in 95 and 96. We invited him to California to talk about Noah's Ark at churches. Yeah. And Bill knew him too and went on one of his tours. But Bill never got to see Noah's Ark, and so he wanted to go out there. He said, "Let's not tell Ron, because Ron will try to convince us not to go because of terrorism threats and everything."
Yeah, so let's live on the edge.
Let's not tell anyone. Let's just go out there.
Don't tell our moms.
So, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I was like, okay, no problem. Thankfully, my parents thought hey, no problem. Send him out of the house. Get him out of here.
Yeah.
So
you actually go.
They sent me overseas, but before I left, I decided I would call Ron. So I told him what we're doing, and his first words were, "Tell Bill to call me right now." So anyways, I talked to Bill, and he was kind of upset, but then he calmed down, and he called Ron, and then I talked to both, and basically ended up, it was all good, but he gave us a lot of good pointers, kind of made us nervous about everything.
I'm sure.
And that first trip was crazy. We were paranoid of everyone, thought everyone was out there to steal stuff or kidnap us.
Yeah.
And so, the Eastern Turkey, when Ron was there, he was threatened and almost killed and robbed. And his first trip was 1977. So Eastern Turkey was it wasn't like going to Paris. It wasn't, it was the Wild West kind of. It wasn't a tourist hotspot for tourists. And so when I was there in 97, it was still kind of a remote area. The nearest airport was 4 or 5 hours drive away in Erzurum. Wow. And so then you had to, find your taxi, or, we had somebody already come out to get us. And then we had to drive 4 or 5 hours on these really bad roads just to get to the city I live in now, Durupinar, which is at the base of the volcano Mount Ararat.
Sounds like the makings for a Taken movie.
Well, so one of the tips Ron gave us when we were there, he said, when you're leaving, tell them you're leaving on a certain date, but you actually leave 2 days before or something. And so we did that. So we're like, we're leaving on Wednesday, and our plan was leave like Monday night.
Yeah.
And so if they're planning to do something to us before we go, we would have been gone already.
Yeah, you're already out of there.
That's how crazy we were thinking. Thankfully, nothing happened to us. But when I first saw that site, I knew I had to come back. And so then 3 years later, in 2000, I came back twice, and I met Dr. Salih Burak Tutan. Now, this was my first time meeting him, but he was involved in the research on the Turkish side since the early 80s. And right now he's retired. He's still alive, but he is assistant professor of geology. And so he's been studying this site and that region for many, many years. And for now, I think he's the expert that's, who's alive and who's well versed in every rock in that area almost. And so I met him for the first time there, and I talked to him about, Noah's Ark and what he thought it was. And, he was quite sure it was not a natural object, that there was something else going on below the surface that's forming this boat shape. And he said there's nothing that suggests it's not Noah's Ark. And so that was really interesting. But between 2000 and 2013, I basically didn't go back to Turkey. I was doing some excavations as a volunteer in Israel and doing other trips and things like that. But in 2013, a friend of mine was organizing a tour and asked if I wanted to come along. And then I reconnected with some of the locals I had first met back in 1997.
Wow.
And so from there, 1 year later, I was there documenting some of the first ERT scans being done on the site by a New Zealand gentleman, John Larson. And this was right. It was crazy because we had to cut our trip short again after 10 days in the field because the Kobani, the uprising, basically, the ISIS was attacking Kobani, which was a city on the border with Syria and Turkey. And the Turks had closed the border, and that was creating a crisis on the Kurdish city of Kobani. And so, the area we're in is a strong Kurdish ethnic area. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people were protesting, and Dobayzet erupted in the protest. They had tires burnings, the rocks being thrown at government buildings, all the shops were closed. And so we had to get out of there. And of course, they don't want us to continue research. Obviously, they don't want any incident with foreigners. But John Larson got enough data. He did 13 scans that peered deep into the soil. And a couple years later, he produced the results showing this looks like a ship hull, just a little outside of the boat formation, but deep in the side of the mountain. Wow. Suggesting that there's something there below the ground that we can't see, but that these geophysical techniques that we use can see. Wow. And so right then I talked to the friend who I knew all these years, this local guy. I said, hey, if we can get permits to excavate somehow, let's do it. So this was 2015. By 2019, I get a call from the Science Channel, and they wanted to film this site. They said, hey, do you have something going on out here? And I said, well, we don't. But then, because of the permit process, getting video permits and all that, we had to set the date in advance. And so they set it for the third week of October 2019. And at the same time, not the same time, but fast forward to August of that year and early September, we were able to get the go-ahead to do GPR, which hasn't been done since Ron was out here.
Wow.
And Baumgartner. Yeah, in the 80s and the late 80s, they did their scans. But that was all analog. That was that thermal paper. Yeah. Now we have digital GPR, so you can slice and dice it, make 3D models.
Cool.
This whole, so this was 2019, and we get the permit to do this, and it happens to be the same week that this crew can come out. It was the same week that the Science Channel was there to film it. Wow. So
that's God's divine provision right there.
Oh man! And the week before that, so when you do GPR, you can't do it in the rain. Like you need dry conditions. Or you don't get a deep penetration of the soil. And so 1 or 2 weeks before that, it was raining. And we were like, the weather was cloudy. It wasn't a bad storm, but it was just really misty and cloudy and cold. And the day these guys showed up to do the GPR, it was a Sunday, I remember, there was clear skies. And for that whole week that they worked, crystal clear skies, no problems. And then Friday, they had a day off before they flew back to the United States, these scientists. And that Friday, they decided to tour around some of the other local tourist sites here, and it rained. Oh, yeah. And so the days that they had to work in the field, we had no rain. It was awesome. And the Science Channel, the first thing that we noticed when we did the scans, the biggest thing that came out of it in the field, about 9 feet down on the east side, we started to see parallel structure, like these reflections coming back that are perpendicular, forming right angles and parallel. And that got the deep. So these are random people that acquaintance who had contacted me, hired, said, hey, my friend works for a company that does GPR based out of Oregon. And so when we brought these people over, they're not looking for Noah's Ark themselves. They're not friends of mine. And we just hired these professionals to do the job. And one of them even said, hey, I'm an atheist. I don't believe Noah's Ark existed and all that, but I'm here to do a job. He was a super nice guy. And even the Science Channel production team, they all came from London. And the producer there, he told me too that our team is basically agnostic or atheist. But when we found those parallel lines and they're like popping up, my friend was videoing the screen of the GPR unit as they were going over that area. And they're scrolling down, like going deeper, 3 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet. And they get to 9 feet, and they suddenly see these lines pop up. He was filming it live, and they were so excited that they we got the science film crew down there, and they were able to video the work, and then they interviewed them later at the visitor center explaining what they saw that day. And that producer who said he's an atheist, he told me the next day, he said, I called my grandmother the night that night because she's a believer. And I told her, hey, we could be we could be filming the real Noah's Ark.
Oh, man.
So she was very excited, and hopefully it made an impact on him.
Yeah. Well, you never know, right? The seed was planted. Yeah. So.
Oh, exactly. And it was within, so we sent all this data, just the raw data, to another scientist. Again, it had nothing to do with our project. We get the raw GPR data that fall. And so by early in 2020, he had his initial report made. And he, Dr. Bigman out of Atlanta, and he was he only briefly worked with us. And that kind of brings us up to what we did with the data again, which I'll explain in a bit. But anyways, he was able to find in that initial analysis these right angles. So this is after Science Channel had left. They produced their show, and then it aired. It's probably still airing on different cable, as repeats. Yeah. But in 2020, it debuted on their channel, and then. But Dr. Bigman was able to pull out of the data and show that there's a whole series of angular structures about 20 feet down, or 21 feet, 7 meters, on the west side of this boat formation. And he said to our team, he said, if I were to excavate, this is the location on the boat, I would want to see what this is. Because he said, usually in nature, you don't see these type of angular structures. So again, we're not digging, but we're using almost like X-ray. We're peering below the soil, trying to understand what's going on, because with excavations, you can't put the data back. You can't put the soil back, and so you dig a big hole and you destroy the fragile shape. And so that's why the Turks are very leery of doing a traditional excavation. And so we have some other ideas we want them to try to pursue, and I'll explain later. But so in 2020, we were able to put out this information about the angular structures that the new radar found from the last year. So we then, 2020, basically that's when the pandemic hit. So everything kind of shut down. Now that's when I kind of moved here. So I had really spent too much time in Turkey the year before. And so when I left the country, I was, they said, oh, you overstayed your visa by, was it 2 months or a month? And so I had to pay some fee and be out of the country for 3 months before I went back to Turkey. But my friend told me, the one who was helping us with the translations and meeting the government officials, he said, hey, when let's focus on the Noah's Ark project next year. But when you come back, let's get you a long-term visa. And this was before the pandemic hit. And so I was visiting him in February. And I just come back from Saudi Arabia, where we're doing research on we believe the real location for Mount Sinai is. So I just come out of Saudi, and I was in Turkey, and that's when the borders closed. And my friend said, "What? Why don't you just stay here? It's cheaper for you to live.
You're 30
minutes. Yeah, you're 30 minutes from the Ark site. You can start making connections with the locals and the officials and see what we can do. Because we didn't know how long the borders would stay closed. Yeah. And so that was what happened. It wasn't really planned. So I got a long-term visa and ended up moving here. And so this now is my base. So we're doing this research, meeting different scientists. By 2023, earlier that year, 2022, I'm sorry, I reconnect with Dr. Salih Barak Tutan. He sends a message. He learns that I'm living near where his home is in Erzurum. That's like 4 or 5 hours west of here. And he contacts a local friend who knew me. And so I met with him finally after 22 years.
20-something years. Wow.
Yeah. And so he is still like sharp, and I had tons of questions to ask him, because I said, hey, some people say, this boat shaped is this or that, or, what did you do here on this trip? And so, I was picking his brain and trying to figure out the history of his involvement in the research. And so we've become good friends. And I told him, hey, we actually did GPR scans in 2019. So we have all this data. We're not working with any geophysicists anymore, the scientists who look at this stuff. Dr. Bigman isn't working with us. So I said, do you know somebody who could take a fresh look at our data? And this was early in 2023. He pointed me to a lady out of New Hampshire or Connecticut. Anyway, she owns her own geophysicist. We call it like survey firm. So, geologists, archaeologists, people looking for oil or gas, they hire her and her team. And so she's been doing this for 40 years. So she has a lot of experience as a geophysicist. And I sent her all, I didn't know her. Dr. Sally knew her and said she was a professional. But I sent her all our raw data. I said, hey, here it is. What can you find in it? And so she was doing this as, as a volunteer.
Oh, that was nice of her.
Yeah, in her free time. So it took a little longer because she was busy with her regular work. But by October, I think it was November actually, of 2023, she went ahead. She emailed us and said, "Hey, did you guys dig a tunnel in here? Is there any utility lines being dug through this site?" And I said, "No, this is the side of a mountain. It's just a remote area." She says, "Well, I'm seeing tunnels, and you guys would be really interested to see what I'm seeing on the screen." And so we did a Zoom call, which I recorded. She showed, she's going through the data, and she's showing that there's this central, what I call the central corridor for Noah's Ark, the central hallway.
Yeah.
And she said this tunnel is still open. It's not completely filled with mud or dirt.
Wow.
And you can hunch back and walk through it, but it starts around 4 meters down, I believe, and goes down another couple meters. And it starts at the pointed upper end of this boat formation and goes down to the middle. And so she had this full tunnel. Then to the side of it, on the inside of the hall, is a broken up one too. So it's kind of like you have a central hallway and then two hallways on the outer.
On the other side.
Yeah, on the outer side, and in between will be the rooms where who knows, the elephants or whatever were kept, the animals were kept. But she said this tunnel goes and then it connects in the middle of the boat with a chamber or cavity that goes down until we lose data, because the end of our radar data is about 13 meters down. So about 5 or 6 meters is the top of this chamber, this cave, which we call an atrium, a central room.
Wow.
And it goes like a pit, and it goes straight down through the formation until we lose the last GPR data. And what's really interesting, I don't know if your listeners ever been to Kentucky and went to the Answers in Genesis Ark Encounter. They made almost a full-size replica.
I was going to ask you if it's similar at some point, because I haven't been there. I want to go there too. There's lots of places I want to go.
Yes, you have to go, because it gives you a great visual representation, and it's almost the same size as this object. I think it's if you were to count all the extra things around it, then I think it's a little longer. But the boat itself, they say in some of the written documentation, it's like 510 feet long. So our site is 515 feet long.
Wow.
Now, I didn't go through some of the I'm kind of just chronologically going through the research, but I will talk about why do we think it's Noah's Ark from the biblical standpoint, and then from our data, and the length has to do with it too. But anyways, so this site in Kentucky, though, if you go inside of it, it's basically again a full replica of Noah's Ark, but they're building what they imagine the Ark to be. And what's interesting, they have a central atrium, this open area that goes through all the 3 decks the Bible says Noah's Ark has. And that's a way to get fresh air and light from above to circulate. This fresh air can circulate through all the levels, and the light can come down. The Bible says there was one window, and so that could light up the inside of the boat.
Wow.
And so their model has this central corridor that's going down the middle of the boat. Now, we have the very same feature we discovered with the radar scans as this central hole in the ground that starts about 4 or 5 meters down and goes down to at least 13 meters and beyond. So, so some of these things are, it's just matching even what some of the modern boat builders are thinking the Ark would need. And here we're seeing it. We're 2 different organizations. They've the fact, to be fair, what they don't believe this is Noah's Ark, and so I don't want people to think that Answers in Genesis or we're not working together. But we hope someday they'll come around. There's plenty of critics or those who say it's just a geological formation, and I'll talk about that more in a bit. But we believe the data is just like Dr. Sally Brock-Touton has said, that there's nothing in our data is pointing that it's not Noah's Ark.
Yeah. Every
time we do something, it's pointing more and more evidence
towards it being Noah's
Ark. That this is a man-made structure in the shape of a boat. And so, what else? I don't think we'll find a plaque that says "Made by Noah and Sons," but you look at circumstantial evidence. So now here I want to kind of dig in to the what the Bible says about Noah's Ark. The Bible is very brief.
Yeah.
I do believe Moses wrote that first book in Genesis, and so when he wrote it, God inspired him and showed him the details. But when he wrote it, he just gave the length, width, and breadth, or height of the boat object. He didn't tell us the shape of it. He didn't tell us like how this one window worked.
Yeah.
Where was the sewer system? Where do they store the food? Where do they sleep? Or how many animals are on it? How many cages or rooms? So there's a lot of details missing. And so, anyways, we believe like these scans are giving obviously insights, and it's matching what even some of these other groups and organizations like Answers in Genesis and their Ark Encounter in Kentucky. It's matching some of their stuff. When you look at the biblical account, it talks about it being 300 cubits. Mm-hmm. Now, today we deal with metrics or the English system, the inches and feet. In Moses' time, the standard of measurement was the ancient Egyptian cubit, the royal cubit. And that was, if you convert that to the inches of today, that's about 20.62 inches. So when Moses said it was 300 cubits long, you take that, times it by 20.62 inches. If you divide that by 12 to get feet, that turns out to be exactly 515 feet long.
Wow.
And that's what this boat is. So when they first got, people got interested in the site, the first thing that caught Dr. or Captain Durupinar's attention was that it's a boat-shaped object. It's sticking out of this hillside. Implanted on this hillside is this boat-shaped object that's unique. There's no other object around it. So that got their attention. And when they get to the ground and start measuring the object, it fits exactly the biblical measurements for Noah's Ark.
Now,
is that a coincidence?
Just to interject real quick, because I find that super interesting. A lot of people don't know, but people of the Muslim faith believe a story of the Ark, right? So, I mean, it would be of interest to them as well, which might be why there's a lot of cooperation between you and them.
That's correct. Yes, the Quran does talk about basically most of the same stories you find in the Bible. Different versions of it or abbreviated accounts, but it does talk about Noah and the flood. Now, a Muslim friend of mine here, he did mention though that in their account, Mrs. Noah doesn't make it on the ark, and so like the biblical account, there are 8 people, Noah and his wife, and then the 3 sons and their wives. But I guess in the Quran account, she doesn't make it. There's little details that, but definitely they believe, those who are at least believers. I mean, you have a lot of Turks who are agnostic or atheists, but those who are believers in the Quran, they believe that Noah existed and there was a Noah's Ark. Now, that point we can agree on. Now, the one thing that the Quran talks about is that it landed on a mountain called Judi. Mm-hmm. And there's a traditional Mount Judi in southeast Turkey in Sirnak province. So that borders Iraq in a part of, I think mainly Iraq and Iran. But Sirnak has this traditional Judi. It's about 200 miles. I forget how many miles south of where I'm at. So in the Bible, though, Genesis chapter 8, verse 4, Moses wrote that Noah's Ark landed in the mountains of Ararat. Now, a couple of things I want to point out about that. So number one, it's usually the plural form there.
Yeah, mountains.
Mountains.
Just one mountain.
So they're talking about multiple peaks or a mountainous region. Now, what about the word Ararat? If you look at the history of that word, the English word Ararat actually comes from the name given for this kingdom that used to exist in this area, especially during the Iron Age of time of King David and Solomon, in Israel as a nation. So the Iron Age, there was a large kingdom here called Urartu, and that's where we get the English word Ararat. Okay. So when Moses was writing, there was this kingdom a lot smaller during his time, but he was basically saying the ark landed in the mountains of the kingdom of Urartu. And so in our Bibles we say the mountains of Ararat, but it'd be like I'm telling you, hey, Noah's Ark landed in the mountains of Canada or mountains of Colorado, and so that gives you like a general area, but it doesn't say which mountain peak. And so our site is in the mountains of the kingdom of Urartu. Urartu was a mountainous kingdom, a lot of castles. Their capital was in the modern city of Vaughan, right on the shores of Lake Vaughan, the largest freshwater lake it's actually a saline lake, but here in Turkey. But even all around where I'm at, I'm 2 hours north of this Vaughan city is Urartu castles here. And Dobizet has a big castle on the side of a mountain.
That's so amazing. That's so cool to me.
They use cuneiform to write, like the Babylonians did. They had a really strong military. They had their own chariots. So on our tours, for example, we do see at least 3 of their castles. So they were a high-tech civilization, but it was in these mountains where the ark landed, and that's where you find the boat-shaped object that's exact length given for Noah's Ark
feet.
in the Bible.
Wow.
You have you have the location basically correct. We're in the mountains of Ararat. You have the length exactly spot on. It's a boat-shaped object, so let's talk about that. So some people, they say, well, Noah's Ark was this rectangular square or a square object or rectangular barge, because the word ark is used also to describe like the Ark of the Covenant, the chest that held the Ten Commandments. Or they say Moses was put into a basket, an ark, a similar Hebrew word, or the same Hebrew word is used there in the story of Moses as a baby, and he put in this reed basket and put in the Nile River. But if you look at all those accounts, in fact, if you go to Cairo today and go to the museums there, and I was just a couple months ago in Cairo, when you look at the examples of the reed baskets they've found in archaeological expeditions, and a lot of the times they find these in the tombs. These reed baskets, they could, you can see how a baby could fit in it. They're small, but they're different sizes and shapes. So the word for these baskets does not have to do with the shape of them, because there are oval ones, there are square, there are rectangular, there are circular baskets. And so who knows which one Moses was put into, or what shape the basket. But the word itself has nothing to do with the shape. It has to do with the functionality. It's a place to store or keep safe something. And
well,
so
it's just like our word basket, right? If I think of a basket, I could go to Hobby Lobby and it could be square, it could be rectangular, it could be round, it could be oval. It doesn't matter. It's a basket, So it's a general word.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then when you look at the dimensions, they say, well, but they give the height, width, and breadth or length. You're looking at that, and they say, well, that just shows it's a rectangle. But again, it's just like me telling someone I have a 5,200 square foot house. If I don't, but if I did, they would say, "Oh, in my mind, if someone told me that, I would not immediately assume it's a square house."
Yeah,
because I don't know. There could be a 2-story house. It could be the L shape. It could be one long, house shape. It just gives you the capacity of the house, the floor plan. Same with this dimensions here. In fact, this was so crazy. We just finished a tour here, and we had 22 people from Florida doing this, our patriarch tours, where we go from the book of Genesis, from Noah's Ark, all the way down to, they say Job was suffering in Şanlıurfa in southeast Turkey, to the story of Abraham and Haran, where you have Jacob and Isaac getting their wives from that area. So you have this connection with the book of Genesis on that tour. But we had an individual we randomly met, and this guy worked under the Bush administration, and maybe, I don't know if he worked under the first Trump one, but he spent many years, I think he said 30 years in the Coast Guard. Wow. In fact, and he was a captain of 2 ships. And now he works for one of these consulting firms, and so one of their projects is advising the Saudi military with I don't know what, but anyways, he a super nice guy, Christian, and we randomly met this guy at the Ark site, and he had been watching my videos. He recognized me. I didn't know who he was, but he introduced himself.
You're famous, you didn't even know it.
Well, and he has his doctorate in, I don't know if it was counterterrorism or something to do with what he did with the Coast Guard, but at any rate, with all his experience with ships in the Coast Guard, he told me, "Hey, Andrew, this is a shipwreck on the side of a mountain. The design of the ship, you have the pointed end uphill, the bow, the rounded end at the stern." He said, "This is the type of design we adopted in World War II for the U.S. ships, and also the Coast Guard now uses for their ships, starting in, I think he said, the late 80s or early 90s. And I was like, wow. And he said, he explained why. He said, look, we know Noah's Ark was not like a sailboat. It didn't have a motor, so it wasn't going to a certain destination. It was just floating on the water.
Yeah. But
he said, with the pointed bow, this enables the Ark to basically cut through the waves that are coming in.
Wow.
And then with he did believe that they had what are called drogue, or these counterweight stones, or balancing, whether they're stones or other objects that are put on the boat to keep it from capsizing, it stabilization stones.
Yeah.
And so he was saying, like, with different ancient technologies, the Ark could basically keep its bow pointed into waves, because he said the worst thing you want is it to become parallel to an oncoming wave and basically roll the boat and capsize.
Oh, yeah.
So he said, that's why you have a pointed bow. And he said, with the rounded stern, same thing. He said, you have waves coming from the back. And with the rounded stern, it basically helps spread out that energy. So it doesn't just impact the boat and cause it to turn around, and then you're parallel with the other waves because you had different directions these waves are coming in with a global storm.
Yeah.
Anyway, we interviewed him at this site and also a nearby archaeological site where he explained all this. I hope to get it up within a week, on my YouTube channel, what he's explaining in like 5 or 10 minute interview. But and so this is what we're seeing here. So
wow.
The issue we have with some of the critics is that in their mind, they really have this idea that the ark is a barge, a flat bottom barge, which is only good for near coastal shallow water areas versus a V-shaped hull with pointed ends, which is a traditional boat shape. Those type of shapes that we're seeing like on the side of this mountain, that's a perfect shape to survive on the open, rough seas. And that's what we believe Noah's Ark had to do. It was in a global storm, a flood. The people who try to say, it's this a barge somewhere on Mount Ararat, they're basing that on the many conflicting eyewitness accounts that there's some ark up there on the volcano. But more and more creationists and Christians are abandoning that mountain, which is about 17 miles north of our site across the valley. But it's the largest mountain in Turkey, and it's called Mount Ararat. Mm-hmm. But it was named that during the Middle Ages. It's like a traditional Mount Ararat. The reason why more and more Christian researchers are abandoning that mountain is because when they look at the geology, they realize this is a stratovolcano or a composite. The other name they use for it, you look on Wikipedia, composite volcano. And basically what that means is every single eruption of this type of volcano, it builds the mountain bigger and taller. Okay. And so it creates a composition or these layers. Yeah. And a stratovolcano does that. So Mount Fuji, Mount St. Helens was one. Mount Rainier in Washington is another one. These type of volcanic cones, and they're well known because they create a cone-shaped peak. And that's what Mount Ararat is. It's a volcano that's been erupting over and over. And so people who say they saw the legendary Noah's Ark up on the side of that mountain, they're basically saying, well, this ark somehow got to the very outside edge of the last eruption, and the lava that formed this mountain didn't push the ark off of it to the base, but kept it up there in a perfectly preserved form.
Yeah, that wouldn't make any. That's not logical.
No, it's violent eruption. The ark would have been buried down below at the bottom of the mountain, or inside the mountain somewhere, and been covered up a long time ago by lava. But then the other thing is, if you look at the geology of where that mountain is at, and you look at what's below it, there are thousands of feet of flood deposits. So this mountain itself was built after the Noah's flood, after the global flood.
So those eruptions occurred post-flood.
Post-flood.
Yeah.
Post-flood, which means there's no mountain before the flood or during the flood or right when the flood ended. There's no mountain for Noah's Ark to land on.
Yeah, so that wouldn't match that biblical account that we
as
Christians.
But the reason why people look there, because there's so many different stories 100 years ago, 200 years ago, of different eyewitnesses who say, I was climbing there as a child, or I was climbing there, and over there I saw what looked like Noah's Ark, or the famous one's Hagopian, an Armenian who on his deathbed said when he was a child, his uncle took the sheep. They were in Vaughan, and they took the sheep on one of these dry seasons, like a drought, and they went to Mount Ararat, and they went up the mountain, and then they saw this perfectly preserved barge. And this guy drew what he saw, and it looks like, this like a shallow water barge. And he says it was all preserved, and he said his uncle set him up on it. And that's what he remembered as a kid. Now, things like that got the whole church and the Christian world excited. It was like, oh, Noah's Ark is on that big mountain. But then when they started doing the geological research, when they started looking at the actual details of all these different stories, we have now eyewitness accounts who put the ark on almost all four sides of the mountain. Yeah. And some say it's in two pieces. Others say they saw it in one piece and at different elevations. So you're basically looking at something that so many conflicting stories that it shows that Noah's Ark does not exist on this post-flood volcano. Yeah. So when you look at our site, we're actually in where there's limestone deposits. We have fossils, all
shellfish, right?
Not freshwater, saltwater sea fossils. Exactly, sand dollars. Other fossils that haven't even been fossilized, the shells are still embedded in the sedimentary rock and well preserved, but they're all in coral. We're finding coral right above the arc site. So this area was definitely underwater at one time, and that's where this is at. And so anyways, that's kind of, all of this information is pointing to this site being Noah's Ark, and that's kept us wanting to do further research.
Yeah.
So what have we done last year? It was very important, I think, because what happened last September, we had a soil scientist from Australia, a Christian, and his wife. They came along to one of the tours, and on that tour, it's just a random person who just came. I didn't know the guy before. They're on the tour, and I was flying my drone. I have one of these drones just to take pictures of the area and of the tour group. And I was taking these pictures of the Ark site, and I pointed out to Dr. Sally Brock-Tuton and Bill Crabtree. He has a master's in soil scientist and many years experience teaching farming techniques around the world. He lectures and everything. Anyways, I show them that the grass is growing. In fact, you don't even need to use the drone. You can see it from the ground. But the grass inside the boat was yellow. Like it was a really strong different color versus the grass right outside the boat, the rim of this hull, the shape.
Yeah.
Right outside of it, and which would be, you think would be just the same type of soil, but right outside that ship shape, the grass is green. Inside was yellow. And I said, "What is going?" So there's some. Probably. Yeah, I was saying, "What's going on with this soil? There's something different." And I said, "Why don't we design a test?" Or you guys, they're the scientists.
Yeah, you're the scientist. You do it.
Design a test that would help us understand what's going on with the soil. And so Bill and Salih, the Turkish geologist, they got together, and I was watching, taking pictures of what they're doing, and they started drawing out this sample plan where they're going to take 88 samples at 22 sites inside and outside of the boat, just random areas. I mean, they're doing this from the visitor center. We don't, then we would go down there, and then Salih would, as a Turkish scientist, he would collect the data. Anyway, so they're doing that, and then they figured out like what type of tests they should do on the samples that we get. So we got all these samples over 2 days. I think Salih was out there. And then by December of last year, he submits all the information, all the samples to Ataturk University, where he used to work at in Erzurum, the Turkish university there, a well-known one. And they were able to give us the raw data back within a couple weeks. And by end of the year, I had in my hands the lab reports. And I sent it off to Bill in Australia, and I even submitted. And then I talked to Salih too about it. But then I submitted the raw data to like ChatGPT and like 3 or 4 of these AIs. Guys like, hey, well, let's see what they know about. And we just want to do an analysis using statistics. Yeah. Number one, we didn't say to the university lab and to ChatGPT or anyone like that. We didn't tell them which samples were taken inside or out.
Yeah.
All we did, we just had the test results back. They're randomly labeled, A1, A2, that type of thing. Yeah. And then we did group them. When I did submit it to ChatGPT, I said, okay, these are 2 groups. What can you tell us? But at any rate, what it shows, which you've seen in some of these news articles, and I'll explain to your listeners, is number one, the 22 sites, we had 6 inside. There was 22 sites, but we got 4 samples at each location. Mm-hmm. And I think 6 of them was inside the Ark. So that'd be 6 times 4. So that'd be 24 samples from inside the boat formation, and the rest was outside. What it showed was, this is so interesting, was that the carbon level, and we went for organic matter, was almost 3 times, I think it was 2.75, almost 3 times more carbon or organic matter inside the boat at a 95% confidence level, meaning that based on the stats, we're there's only a 5% degree of that this could be wrong for the journal for all the samples we took. And then we submitted this to one of Bill's friends, who's he actually has his PhD in soil science and is agnostic, so he's not even a Christian. And he examined it, and he picked out the exact same thing that like ChatGPT and Bill and Salih showed. That he said, okay, out of all the different things we're testing for, pH, organic matter, phosphorus, we also checked for potassium, and one other thing had to do with electrical connectivity. So even the things that don't show that they're different, that's important information. Yeah. For example, I think it was potassium, that one was the same. And some people have said, well, maybe you're getting these type of results because people farmed it. Well, they farmed inside and out the boat, and back in the 40s and before, so over 60 years ago. But it's not affecting, like we're getting the same phosphorus levels, so it's not, nothing's changed there. But the organic matter, which was really interesting, Ron Wyatt's 1979 test, which was only one sample at one location inside the boat and then one outside, he was getting, just with the one sample, the same type of almost 3 times carbon inside the boat.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Remnant Wire. We'll be back next week to continue our conversation with Andrew Jones from Noah's Ark Scans. If you haven't done so already, be sure to download our new Remnant Wire app for iOS and Android. Also, please prayerfully consider financially supporting the ministry of Remnant Wire. We are entirely listener-supported. Until next time, this has been a word from the Wire. God bless.